Hi everyone. Guys, on the Sunday seminar, thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Brendan. Some of you may have met me, some of you may not. In terms of a brief introduction, I'm one of the members of the adjudication corps for Easters this year, so hopefully I'll meet most of you there. In terms of what this presentation will cover, I'm just going to provide some general, I would say guiding principles of philosophy of judging, as well as some pointers for the process. I just guess as a caveat, this presentation will reflect merely my opinions on judging, not necessarily reflective of that of the Adj Corps. I feel like I have to make that caveat. But also, these aren't hard and fast rules, for the simple reason that they aren't really hard and fast rules in debating. It's a bit more complicated than that. Take it as much from what you want from this activity or this presentation, or as little as you want. These are things that have worked for me and might be useful in helping you, I guess, maybe conceptualize the mindset of judging, which is to say that a lot of this will be fairly conceptual, maybe not too overly abstract, because I think in terms of the methods of judging, there are very many different ways that work for different people. What matters more is the end outcome of arriving at, for example, a fair and consistent adjudication rather than the means. Okay, so I want to start off with a little thought experiment. There's essentially I don't know how much you guys follow those Doom threads and debating series posting and various other Facebook groups dedicated to such activities. But if you ever read any of those disagreements about how people should do judging, essentially a lot of those disagreements boil down to a fundamental clash of schools of thought on judging, which is just the extent to which debating is either a subjective process of interpretation or an objective process of piecing together claims and breaking down analysis and seeing how much of it is proven. So, I don't necessarily profess to have the answer to that fundamental clash, but I think I might have a way of maybe understanding it a bit better. And I thought the best way to do that is to sort of compare debating as a general strategy game to maybe the most famous strategy game, which is the game of chess. So, I don't know how much you guys have ever played chess. I'm not very good at it myself. But in general, back before we had engines or computers that were really good at basically breaking down it quantitatively, when you evaluate chess from a human perspective, you tend to follow three things. The first is that you look at a position and you think, well, what are the rules of chess, which are kind of important, bishops move diagonally, checkmate means if the king is under attack and can't move a square. And then you calculate, which is to say, you look at the position and you go, well, if I move the knight here, what does that do? And then lastly, you weigh a bit more intangible positional advantages. So things like, for example, is my king in danger? Is it useful for my rook to be on this particular file? And the reason why I'm going through this process is that debating or adjudicating debating positions or the debate as it happened tends to follow a pretty similar process. So in terms of rule sets, there are a few hard and fast rules in debating. For example, in debates that are policy phrased, so debates with would and should, you can have fiat. But you can't have fiat in support or opposed motions, or the other rule, which is that third speakers can't introduce new substantive. So that factors in your adjudication process. The next thing you have to do is calculate. Now, obviously, calculations in debating is a little fuzzier, but what I mean by this is you look at the claim, and to some extent, you have to break down how much that claim has been proven. So what has been said, how much of it equals an argument that you believe has been successfully established in this debate. And the last thing you have to do is weigh positional advantages. And here the word weighing probably might be a bit more familiar to you. It's well, okay, the AF have this argument, the neg have this argument, but maybe the AF's argument is strategically better placed because it affects more people or affects people more intensely compared to the negative team. So that's the ways in which you can draw comparisons between chess and debating, the extent to which it's familiar and similar. But where I would say debating differs, and probably why debating is a bit more subjective than chess, is twofold. The first thing to say is quite obviously, in chess, the pieces are real, right? They exist on a board and you can see them. Whereas the pieces in the game of debating are a bit more like abstract, like they're just words that people say, and they don't really exist on their own. They have to be sort of interpreted into existence. And it's that act of interpretation that injects a little bit of fuzziness and subjectivity into debating, because sometimes what people say might not necessarily correspond to what judges hear, receive, and therefore comprehend and understand when it comes to their understanding of debate. The other thing is that quite obviously calculations are a little more qualitative. So maybe you would know that bishops are like worth 3 points and pawns are worth 1 point. But there really isn't like a corresponding system for debating. It's not like this type of argument is like 5 points of persuasiveness, more persuasive than the other. Which means that the judgment calls that we make about debating are a little bit more qualitative. So, you know, instead of saying this argument is very proven by 70%, you might say, well, this argument is more proven than this other argument, and maybe it's by a little bit much, but it's hard to necessarily quantify. So I hope that might be helpful. That is by far, by the way, the most abstract, high concept part of this presentation. So if you were thrown by that, don't worry. I just thought it might be a useful starting point to sort of think about how to judge. So, guiding principles. Basically, I think I tried to come up with a like relatively catchy way of phrasing this, so you know, alliteration might work. So there's 3 C's to achieve. I think these are the first one is relatively straightforward. You want to kind of comprehend the debate. That involves, I guess, a 2-step process. It involves you tracking and having an accurate record of what was said in the debate, and then an ability to understand what has been said. I think the second one bears more attention in terms of explaining consistency of adjudication. What I mean by this is that in light of the fact that what we've said before, which is that debating gets a little subjective, I think it's hard to necessarily place a premium on objectivity. Like, there'll be some differences in the ways in which adjudicators interpret arguments. So what you're not aiming for is like total, universal, scientific objectivity. What you're trying to aim for is within your own way of judging, you want to have consistency. You want to make sure that for yourself, you would watch the same debate 7 times and you would get the similar result 7 times. Does that kind of make sense? And I think you can break that kind of consistency down into 3 things. Wrong one. But the first thing you want to make is internal consistency, which is what I was saying earlier, right? And a good example of this might be, so for example, within an OA, you might be like, well, this team's argument is only partially proven because they have missed this burden. And then what you want to make sure is that you don't, in the same OA, in a separate issue, credit an argument despite the fact that they had the exact same problem as the previous argument in the other issue, right? And that's a good example of making sure that you are internally consistent, which is to the extent that they are gray areas or judgment calls. You make those calls fairly throughout the debate. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure there's some kind of external consistency, which is to say that there are a few hard and fast rules in debating that every judge ideally should be following. Things like third speakers can't introduce new substantive. You want to make sure you're consistent to a set of rules. And the last thing you want to be consistent with is comparatively, which is to say that sometimes it might be, you might fall into a trap of saying, well, the affirmative team needs to prove this in order to win. But sometimes that would also be true of the negative team. But sometimes adjudicators would put a burden on one team and not put the burden on the others. So having that kind of double standard is also something that most judges, or not most judges, sometimes when they make errors occasionally fall straight into. And the last thing to say is you obviously want to explain that relatively clearly in the oral adjudication. That might sound straightforward, but I think it's kind of worth stressing why it matters, in the sense that, well, I guess like the personal incentive is you want to make sure you, as a judge, probably get scored relatively well by the teams, so the clarity of an explanation will help you there. But I think like more like pedagogically speaking, at the end of the day, I think the process and the exercise of the oral adjudication is sort of like a way of making teams feel like the due process has been followed, which is to say that, when it comes to 3v3, there are 2 teams. You could, in theory, get the right answer by like flipping a coin or something, but that wouldn't make teams feel very confident in your ability to fairly adjudicate. So the oral adjudication is merely a means for you to demonstrate to the teams that you have followed all the steps, ticked every box, so on and so forth. But also, I think it's important in the sense that it is a useful way for teams to learn from the debate. And I think that's quite important. Like, there is a real educative value to the oral adjudication, which is another reason why we would place a premium on accuracy, because we want teams to learn genuinely, and we don't want them to leave with any misconceptions. Okay, that's the 3 C's to achieve. I think that is relatively more straightforward. In terms of the 2 C's to avoid, I kind of want to spend a bit of time going through this, because I think these are quite important. So, the first thing I have here is like convenient decisions over the correct ones. Now, what I mean by this, and I want to do stress, like when often you hear a lot of judging seminars at minis and tournaments, you often hear adjudication cores cautioning against unconscious biases. And of course that is unfortunately a problem. Now, to some extent, those unconscious biases come from a place of malice. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of the time as well, those unconscious biases are unconscious. They don't necessarily come from a bad place. Why I do think they frequently pop up is when adjudicators who are faced with a, let's face it, pretty difficult task of adjudicating a complex claim with a lot of back and forth between teams, they want a shortcut. And when they take those shortcuts, they fall prey to subconscious biases, which means that they lead to an erroneous decision. So, as by way of an example, I think a lot of times rep biases would fall into this kind of category of mistake. For instance, an adjudicator, maybe someone who's not feeling super confident, goes into a debate, it's really complicated, they're not sure what the right answer is, and they think, well, it might make my life more convenient if I give it to the team that I think would have won the debate or is more expected to win the debate, because they're more likely to give me a better time, or they'll give me a harder time if I gave them the loss. That's obviously a convenient decision. In some senses, if we're in their shoes, an understandable decision, but it's unfortunately also an incorrect decision. So I really want to stress that I understand that debating can be very difficult, but it's perfectly permissible for you to acknowledge the difficulty of that in your oral adjudications, rather than trying to take shortcuts to make your life more convenient, but make the lives of the debaters that you have, whose fate is in your hands, a little less convenient. So, convenient decisions often lead to unconscious biases. The next thing I have is certainty that ignores complexity. And where I think this comes from is that, in some senses, like, what we're all doing as either debaters or as adjudicators is trying to appear more certain than we are. Like, the reality is, like, all of us are human. We may not know everything about the intricacies of the various motions that we've only had like 30 minutes to prepare for, or an hour to watch and scrutinize. And that means that we often feel, I think, a need to appear more confident and certain than we are. And again, it's that very understandable human motivation that leads to incorrect decisions or misinterpretations of how complex and close the debate actually was. So a good example that I think sometimes happens is that you thought about a debate, it's kind of close, but eventually you arrive at what you think the answer is. You think the negative wins. And because you think the negative wins, you sort of then go back through your notes, and with that confirmation bias in mind, you are really sure that the negative team wins. You want to make sure that's clear to the teams in the OA. And what you end up doing is convincing yourself the negative team has won like in every single way possible. So therefore, in your OA, you turn what was in fact like a very close, could have gone either way debate into like a blowout that the negative team has, which is very, very far from what the debate actually was. That's a very understandable phenomenon and happens a fair bit. Another example might be like, during the debate, you're sort of pretty certain that one team is decisively winning. And, as many debaters might do, or adjudicators might do, you've constructed your notes and you're beginning to write the OA to reflect that. Suddenly, like, pretty good speech from the other team happens and you're like, oh no, like, I think that the tides have turned. But by this point, I don't know, maybe it's inconvenient, maybe this is like fairly late in the debate, you're sort of less hesitant to accept those new speeches and those new arguments because they're making your life harder, because you don't want to accept that level of doubt. You're certain in one assessment, and kind of you don't want to open the can of worms and deal with that, and therefore you think of ways to disregard that material, and so on and so forth. These are examples where people tend to prioritize certainty and clarity of a decision rather than the correct, maybe more complicated and messy decision. So those are the two C's to avoid. Cool. The last thought I had, before I go into like, I guess, tips on the process of judging, is just that to address the distinction between a very good judge versus a judge that scored well. Because, you know, I understand at the end of the day, like, you know, that's essentially what you're measured on, scores. I do want to stress though that like, I'm fairly certain, maybe I'm optimistic, but I'm fairly certain that being a good judge, like 99% of the time invariably leads to being a well-scoring judge. But, you know, there are probably ways in which you could get away with being a slightly more conniving judge and still get good scores. And I would strongly urge you guys to not fall and for that temptation, resist it. So for example, like, it might be plausible that the way you get good scores from your team is to like sound really confident in your oral adjudication, use a bunch of big words, make it seem like you know everything about this topic, and sort of convince the other two teams of like, well, this guy seems to know what he's talking about, I'll just take him at his word. That would be maybe a way to get a good score, but certainly wouldn't be very educative and informative for the teams in the room. So, mostly there is overlap. The extent to which there isn't, please don't exploit it. I just think gaming system does, in the long run, not help anybody. It doesn't help you in the sense that it doesn't help you become a better adjudicator. It doesn't help the teams because they don't really take away the right lessons from that. Yeah, with great power comes great responsibility. I think by this, what I mean is that, you know, there's sort of two ways to think about adjudicating. Like, in one sense, for instance, it's the team's job to kind of make arguments towards you. And you do have like a fair bit of, you know, legitimate discretionary power to decide that. I would say that rather than focusing on debating or adjudicating as a position of power, we want to think of it more in terms of responsibility. Like obviously, you know, when you're adjudicating in a large major, people are perfectly entitled to want to do well, like you want to focus on breaking. But you have to realize, I think, two things. The first thing is the consequences of botching it as an adjudicator are tend less to you than it does to the teams. So, which is to say that maybe you get it wrong. To you, that would only have the indirect cost of maybe resulting in bad scores from the team that you adjudicate, like maybe. But you getting a decision wrong would have a far more certain consequence on the teams in the debate. Like they'll be frustrated, they would be immediately competitively disadvantaged. Also the other thing is like, I guess there's 6 of them and there's 1 of you. So obviously I don't mean that to say, you know, you have like enormous kind of like existential pressure on your shoulders to get it right every time. I just think you should take that in mind when you're considering like, maybe like, do I really want to put like an extra effort into really litigating this? It only takes 30 seconds more time, but it means a lot and it means the world sometimes to the team. So I would encourage you to think about that as well. And lastly, I guess the best way to think about it is if you're a team at a major in round 6 and you really need this team, you really need this win to break, what would you want the adjudicator to do? And then I think it'd be fair to also extend that courtesy to the teams when you're in that position. So, yeah, that's pretty much it for the kind of initial overview. I'm happy to answer any questions if people have them before I go into the rest. No? All right, too easy. Okay, on tracking. So we're starting with tracking, then on like how to assess whether arguments are proven, and then comparing arguments. So on tracking, I've written here like you want to avoid the twilight zone. I think this is sort of, when we think of the many pitfalls that might happen to you as an adjudicator, this is the first and pretty big one. Like when you hear teams who are really frustrated with the calls they get, I would say, you know, around 70% of the time, the reason why they get, you know, frustrated is mainly because teams don't feel like they were heard by the adjudicator. They might feel like, well, you know, like the claims we said, they just didn't appear in the OA, or like the adjudicator just seemed to kind of talk about the debate as if, like, and it was just totally divorced from the debate that they think happened. And I think, you know, those things aren't necessarily a product of like malice or like really, you know, like anything really drastic. Like it just is simply a breakdown in communication. And whilst those things are regrettable, I think it is possible and certainly advisable for adjudicators to do their best to preempt and make sure those breakdowns in communication don't happen. And I think the kind of best way and
mindset to sort of approach and avoid this problem is that you want to think about judging as a way of reconstructing the round rather than necessarily reinterpreting it. So another way of thinking about it is your job is like a fact finder, like a researcher, rather than, I don't know, let's say like a journalist or a playwright. You're not telling the story of the debate. The debate is sort of like an artifact that, as an archaeologist, you're sort of excavating and putting the records and the pieces of the puzzle together. Which is to say that your job, as much as possible, you are trying to make your job easier for yourself. And the best way to make it easier for yourself is just to point to claims that have been said and just evaluate them as they were said, rather than maybe potentially exposing yourself, putting your neck out there, and sort of filling in gaps and intervening in that sense. So credibility is obviously, and also finally, credibility is more likely to be something that you get if you are able to refer to arguments that people said, rather than sort of elaborating and sort of saying your own version of what you think has been said. And yeah, communication takes two to tango. Obviously, it'd be ideal if teams, were able to perfectly articulate their thoughts in a way that you could completely, obviously understand them. Sometimes that doesn't happen. And yes, maybe like we could say, well, that's on you, like you could have done better. That's certainly true. But I think, in the interest of keeping everyone happy, the other way to avoid that issue is for you to take a bit more work into actively trying to listen to ensure that when there are imperfections in communication, you still are able to understand them. So they still feel heard and everyone feels happy at the end. So what's some advice that I have, practically speaking, in order to avoid this problem? I think the big one is that when it comes to sort of tracking, you want to kind of keep in mind what the value of writing down what a speaker is saying. Because at the end of the day, what we want in terms of an end outcome is to have an accurate judgment of the debate, and the record is just a means to an end to that judgment. So you shouldn't be writing for writing's sake. You should be writing so that you are able to have an accurate understanding of what's been said, rather than at the end of the day, you're not being awarded based on how accurate your stenograph is of the debate. You're rewarded based on the ability for you to have a judgment. So that's why you shouldn't write for writing's sake. You should write to understand the other team's argument, or the team's argument. I think the second thing, don't judge the painting by the first brushstroke. What I mean by that is that I think you want to resist temptation when you're tracking an argument to sort of, as soon as you hear like a certain word, to go like, oh yeah, I know exactly what they're saying. So, I think the way this temptation manifests is that this is probably how most debaters track when they are speaking. And that makes sense, right? Because when you're debating, it's like really, you're under a lot of pressure because you have to track an opposition's argument and then you've got to think of responses. You're really under a time crunch, which is why when you hear things, you sort of have to go with your first instinct of what this argument is, right? And that means when you hear the word backlash, you go like, okay, I'm assuming they're going to make this argument, I'm going to run with that. As an adjudicator, you're not really under as much pressure because you're not really competing in the sense. You have more time to, I think, sit back and take the argument as it is. And I would encourage you to not make really quick assumptions as to what the speaker is saying. Instead, take maybe like an extra 5 seconds to really think and hear them out and go, okay, so what they're saying is a bit more nuanced than maybe my first judgment would have them believe. I think the third thing is that where it is possible, I think it'd be useful to quote directly. And I'm certainly not saying that you need to have like a word for word recount of what the speakers have said, but I think it's useful to use their words and to have an accurate reflection of that for at least, for example, the headlines, maybe like the labels for the mechanisms that they say. And the reason why you want that is because we have to, as much as possible, sort of treat each word that a speaker says as intentional. Like, there's a reason why they've said that word as opposed to another word. And words sometimes can be traded for one another, but as we know, sometimes it gets slippery. So calling an argument like backlash against, social movement doing something might really kind of take away the meaning and the extra layers of nuance that a speaker has actually said. So that's why I think it's useful to have their words, because it means that you're less likely to misunderstand what they're saying and merely judge what you think they've said rather than what they've actually said. The other thing is also, when it comes to making teams happy, the best way to make teams happy is to make them feel heard. And the best way to make them feel heard is when you parrot back the words that they say. I think the last thing is that you want to be generous in comprehension rather than credit. What I mean by that is like, where there is ambiguity, and there will inevitably be ambiguity when you're judging claims that are often said quite rapidly to you in an 8-minute speech. Sometimes it's like, well, I'm not sure if that's what they mean, or whether they've actually said maybe an argument or a version of the argument that is not quite as good. I think, and I want to be careful here, assume intent, that they've tried to make the best possible argument of the thing that you think that they have said, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you would accept the argument as being proven. So I think it's worth being generous in intent and assuming that teams have said the best possible version of what you think they've said, but that being said, you can always evaluate them and credit them as an entirely separate matter. So that's my thoughts on tracking and comprehension. Okay, on assessing degree of proof, I have like 3 slides dedicated to this because I think this is like probably one of, if not the hardest part of adjudicating. So, yeah, I think so. The main thing that I want to really stress here is that you want to, I think, as much as possible, turn assessing an argument as being proven from a game of like vibes of like, well, you know, like it probably is, to like, well, no, I actually have some system of sort of assuring you that this argument has been like to some extent proven, and I'm able to delineate that in a matter of degrees rather than sort of like guesstimating. So obviously there isn't like an objective unit of like, there's no SI unit, at least now, of like proving out how much an argument or a mechanism is credible. But at the very least, you have your own judgment, and by your own judgment, it should be something that's consistently measurable. And I think the first way to start is by having a useful process for you to figure out how arguments are proven. And I have a list here. And yeah, what I have written out is, if we think about the chess analogy earlier, this part of debating is sort of like figuring out what pieces teams have in town. So one, is the claim permissible? That's useful for things like, for example, like late responses from third negative, but it could also maybe extend to like, can this argument be run in a debate about like an hypothetical, you can't use fiat, so that claim would be validated. Second is, does this claim stand on its own? Is it proven in a vacuum? So not factoring any responses, is what they've said something that you would believe? Lastly, does this claim survive contact with basically other material in the debate? And I think that order is quite important. So like pre-existing material, explicit responses, and implicit responses. So implicit responses being things that the opposition haven't flagged as a response necessarily, but clearly, if you look at it, interacts with the material. Like it's a roadblock to the line of logic the claim that you're assessing is trying to advance. So that's a useful, I think, list to go through. Okay, to sort of break it down even further, I think a very simple way of adjudicating how arguments are proven is to consider what the structure of fulfilling something logically is. And there are only really, I think, 2 main parts we're going to consider. There are conclusions, and then there are conditions. So like condition, and it's, I don't know if you guys have ever done those like syllogisms. It's like, you know, like Socrates says, like every man has like 2 legs, like a bird has 2 legs or whatever. Is a bird a man? It's one of those things. But essentially, you're breaking down arguments into premises is another way of thinking about it, and those premises add up and you get to a conclusion at the end. Now, what I've written there is that when you're evaluating how an argument is proven, you got to use a benchmark, right? And that benchmark is the conclusion. And I think you should try to make sure that it's the conclusion the speaker intends rather than what you think it should be. And a good example of why that's an important distinction to make is, for example, sometimes like you hear adjudicators go like, well, this team is trying to claim that this would like solve and create world peace, but they didn't prove that they created world peace, therefore they lost. And then usually the team goes like, but that's not the conclusion I was reaching for. I was just trying to like, I don't know, de-escalate tensions in this particular conflict in the world. So that's why it's really important that you're going by what the team is trying to say, rather than sort of taking the conclusion that you think generally the argument is reaching for. The other kind of principle I have is that assessing proof is a bit like a like a game of lock and key, which is to say that you're sort of looking at a conclusion and then you're saying, well, does their material fit that conclusion? And there are two levels to this. So sometimes you got to consider whether the claims that people have said end up reaching the final impact, but also you have to consider, well, the claim, you can't just say anything to prove, for example, statements like, China will retaliate. You would need to write reasons as to why that initial condition is fulfilled. I think the last thing that's kind of important to say is that a lot of the time, I think the way in which considerations of proof are discussed are pretty binary. It's like, well, the have proven their argument, the neg have not, therefore the app wins. I think in many cases, the answer is unfortunately not so simple. So sometimes what you want to consider as an adjudicator is, this is what the conclusion is, this is how much the team has tried to prove, and what does that gap look like? Like how far off from the conclusion is the team left with? And usually a partly proven argument is not the same as a totally non-proven argument. It usually means that they aren't able to reach the full impact that they're striving for. So that might mean that their impact is smaller, it just affects fewer people, it's less intense. It might be that the impact is less frequent. So instead of all of the time this happens, maybe some of the time it happens. Maybe the people involved in it is not as prevalent as they claim it to be. So maybe instead of like most people in this particular group will act in this way, some enclave of this group will, and that's as much as they've proven. Or maybe even the probability of the impact occurring is a bit smaller. So instead of like 90% of the time, maybe it's like 60% of the time. And maybe instead of doing action X, maybe do action Y instead. So at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is trying to make sure the team doesn't feel like what they've said effectively amounts to nothing. Like often teams have said enough for them to have something on the table. Maybe it's not the thing that they want, but it's still something, and it's your job to figure out what that something is. All right, so that's, I think a lot of what I've said earlier extends to the problem where you're looking at what the teams have said and whether that ends up equating to the outcome that they want. I think that is, that has its own kind of complications. But where I think things get much trickier is assessing whether a condition is met in the first place. So for example, if you're taking the argument that, like this would cause World War III, that's the conclusion. One of the claims would presumably be this causes a nuclear power to react hostilely. It's whether the reasons that people have given for that condition, whether they are met, that's where things get a little fuzzy. The tip I have for this is that you can sort of break it down recursively, which is to say that conditions can themselves be mini conclusions with their own conditions. So using my example, it's like nuclear power will react hostilely. That's not like a standalone thing. That itself has a kind of chain of events that lead up to that, right? Like, government needs to vote it in. Before the government needs to vote it in, it needs to be popular, and so on and so forth. So you can break down conditions into a set of tinier conditions and eventually reach a point where it's like fairly obvious, and you can kind of decide pretty intuitively whether something has been proven or not. I think the quick process that you have for this is like, if you look at a statement that someone has said to prove something empirically, you ask yourself, has there been any logic given? Does the logic make sense? If you genuinely can't, then I guess you have no choice to reject it. But usually what happens is that teams don't have like nothing to say. They have something which sounds plausible. You could maybe foresee kind of problems of it. The way I would kind of solve that dilemma is to accept it with doubt and pinpoint where the weaknesses lie. What I mean by that is like, I think it's worth kind of considering as an adjudicator that a lot of the time you're dealing with claims where the right answer is like maybe. And I think in general, maybe people and humans, we find uncertainty difficult to tolerate. But it's something that I think as a judge you have to get used to, which is to say, I think it's fair to say as an adjudicator, well, this claim has been said. I think it is to some extent, in some cases, it is plausible. You might want to illustrate those cases briefly, but in other cases, it's not. And the reasons why this argument is not fully certain is because, this link is kind of not apparent, kind of stretches it a bit here. So I think you can always accept claims as being somewhat probable with doubts, because you can always reject them later. And it's very useful to consider arguments rather than sort of just rule them out entirely, right? And I think, like, just as a kind of pragmatic tip, I think teams are much more willing to believe that their claim was kind of plausible, but then because of an opposition response got deleted, rather than this argument just like never got to the table in the first place. People tend to be pretty, they tend to love, like the arguments they say, which is why it's a bit easier for them to be let down easier by saying this claim had some problems in the construction and was rebutted later, rather than being ignored entirely. I think to emphasize, when an argument you think has some problems with it, but is still proven enough to meet like the bar of whether it's proven standalone, keep those in mind when you're factoring in responses. Because an argument that is weaker initially would require a weaker response to dispel. So that's usually, I think, useful. So like in, to use another kind of example, it's kind of like in Pokemon, you have like an HP bar, sometimes like some Pokemon have like more hit points than another Pokemon. So like a weakened argument would have like be on half-life or something. So it doesn't need like a critical hit to knock out. It just requires like an ineffective response, and even that would work. So I don't know. That's how I think of it. Maybe another example might work better for you. Okay, so we figured out how we can assess whether an argument is proven on a standalone basis. Now we got to think about like how we compare those arguments. So what does that process look like? Well, first of all, to compare two arguments, you're gonna make some decision on what those arguments look like on their own. So you've got to establish a baseline after a standalone assessment of that claim. At the end of that assessment, you need to know, well, how big is the argument they've actually proven? What is its initial scope, its initial probability? And if there are any problems with this argument, where are those problems? Because those problems might be the very things that bring that argument down later. Next thing you want to do is you want to factor in responses in other interactive material. So those responses can either shrink down that claim or mitigate it further, or if they're especially well targeted and are probing at those weaknesses, it might mean that the argument is just collapsed altogether. Then you want to repeat and rinse and repeat that for the other team, and then at the end of that, you want to compare what's left standing. Now, I think that is, relatively straightforward. I think where I would say judges might fall into common pitfalls around this are twofold. The first is often, I think, judges put double standards or asymmetric standards of when it comes to assessing burdens of proof. So for example, an adjudicator might feel like, well, to prove that this argument would cause war, the act needs to prove either it causes a war or it doesn't cause a war. So this is like really like a binary thing. Now, that's true for the affirmative team, but it's also kind of true for the negative team that they also need to prove that it doesn't cause war. Like the binary burden applies to both teams in this debate, which is why sometimes it's important to realize the extent to which burdens are reciprocated, like both teams face that burden, or in instances where it is not. So for example, maybe it's only true that the negative team need to prove why, all of these things need to be met in order for it to be true, but the AF just need to prove that one point in the chain it doesn't work and it leads to their benefit. So sometimes it's reciprocal, sometimes it's not, but it's worth checking that rather than automatically assuming that it only applies to one team rather than another. I think another way you can get around that is always by asking yourself, whenever you're making an assessment for one team, ask yourself, does this apply to the other team? Like, is this comparative? Like sometimes you can catch yourself before you make a mistake by asking like, okay, so I don't think this argument is very, very good because maybe it's like, it's not clear why it affects many people. Well, that might be true, but it also might be true that the negative team's impact affects even less people, right? So it's always useful to ask yourself, is this comparative? Is what I'm saying true or more true than it is of the other team? And that's where I think you can sort of catch yourself and keep yourself accountable. The last thing I want to stress is that responses aren't automatically easier to prove. Now, I want to clarify what I mean by this statement. So, logically speaking, when it comes to like purely destructive responses, so responses that are showing that an argument is wrong, those definitionally speaking are easier to prove. So a good example of this is like, I don't know, if you know, like in maths, to say a statement like every person does X, that's an argument that you can easily disprove by giving like one example of a person not doing that, right? So in that instance, it is true that a truly negative response that contradicts a statement is easier to disprove than it is to prove the original statement, right? The problem though is that these types of responses on their own are very rarely useful responses or useful responses on a standalone basis. And what I mean by that is like, it might be true that the response like neutralizes the argument, but that doesn't necessarily automatically mean that the other team wins, right? Because teams ultimately have positive contributions and negative contributions. The negative contributions merely whittle down the other team's positive contribution, but it doesn't add pluses to your own column, if that makes sense. And the extent to which it does add a plus, well, needs to be proven in the other way. So to use an example that I think might concretize what I mean by that, there's like a certain like genre of responses that people love making, and you know, like we call them like flips. So it's like, well, the affirmative team proved that like this would create less poverty, but here's reasons why it would create more poverty. Now, I think there is kind of a problem where I think to some extent adjudicators credit flips a lot more than they should be. And I think the reason why is because flips are actually really, really hard. Because in order to prove why something creates the opposite of what a team has claimed, you firstly need to disprove the idea that it does something. So if the claim is this causes more poverty, less poverty, and you're trying to claim more of it, you first need to prove that it doesn't cause less poverty. So you need to neutralize it. And then you need to prove the other direction, which is that it causes more poverty. Does that make sense? Those are two separate stages, which means that if anything, a flip is actually harder to prove than the initial argument because it does like one additional extra level of logic. So I think it's important to understand responses don't automatically aren't things that you should just take immediately for granted, and that's quite important. And I think this kind of last tip is sort of, if you think about it, a useful way of explaining how a lot of things happen and people aren't super happy about it. So for example, like, you know, there's a lot of discourse around like, you know, first speakers get undercredited, later responsive speakers might get overcredited. And I think a reason for that is because a lot of people might fall into this trap where they're like, okay, a response has been made that takes out the argument, and they just accept the response as being very quickly credited without necessarily doing the necessary legwork to assume that that response has actually been proven. Cool. All right. On weighing arguments. Now, I think the first point may be something that might be familiar to you guys, like how like impactful or weighty an argument is just like how true it is times how important it is. The thing that I've written there and involved in is the part that I, you know, if you haven't guessed, is sort of the focus of this lecture, which is like, it's not just when an argument is important and likely, it's how much that likelihood or importance has been demonstrated to you by the words the team has said. And I think that kind of third way of adjudicating claims is often a very useful way of ultimately breaking down a lot of clashes. So the kind of second thing I have here is something that if you want to check for yourselves is basically what the world's judge manual recommends as a way of breaking down clashes. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff also is echoed in that judge manual as well. The things I want to emphasize is that I think often adjudicators are very willing to just accept weighing metrics and to take them for granted. But you have to understand that a weighing metric isn't like a special piece of argument that's exempt from any scrutiny. It's an argument, which means that you need to consider whether it's been proven. And I suspect maybe the reason why weighing criteria tend to be over accepted is maybe the same reason why flips and other rebuttal is over accepted, which is just that it's a classic example of the problem we identified earlier, which is judges making convenient decisions rather than correct ones. So typically a lot of weighing is done later in the debate, where it's an hour in. As an adjudicator, you're probably already pretty tired, things have gotten really, really confusing and complicated for you. At that point, you're just willing to sort of accept anything that might make your life easier. So you hear the words like, this affects more people, it affects vulnerable stakeholders, you're like, oh, thank God, like, all right, that's why the affirmative team is winning. You want to resist that temptation, right? Like, I know it's hard, but you got to ask yourself, well, does this argument, in fact, affect more vulnerable people? Are these people more vulnerable? I think the last thing is that the kind of interaction between likelihood and importance is very important. Like, yeah, I heard myself, yeah, like, importance is important, yeah. Likelihood is important too, because I think, if you think about it, both of them are necessary but insufficient conditions for an argument to be weighted. Like, I think sometimes we place an overt premium on impacting, because maybe teams don't do enough of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that impacting is inherently more important than proving the argument that it is being impacted. Because if you have, like, let's say a very important impact that happens 1% at a time, you're not really left with much. And I think sometimes adjudicators tend to overly credit arguments for the reason that teams have demonstrated to great lengths that it is very impactful without considering how probable it is and how that equates to the final question. The last thing I want to say is that often, unfortunately, the kind of golden kind of standard for like how we assess arguments and whether they're proven just ultimately doesn't work. A good example of this is like, you know, let's say you're adjudicating a very good debate, and then like the app is like, well, you know, we affect more people, and the negative are like, well, that may be true, but the people we affect, like, we should care about them more. Like, they're really severely affected. And I often get this question of like, is there any like logical way of breaking that down? Like, how does one adjudicate between an impact that affects many people and one impact that affects many people very severely? And the answer to that question is like, there really isn't like an objective right answer to that question. Like, there just literally isn't. So the only way you can really assess that is by quantifying the extent to which both those statements are true. Like the extent to which how many people are affected versus the extent to which how many people are severely affected. And the only way you do that is by just considering how much the speakers have said to prove those respective claims. So at the end of the day, I suspect, you know, more often than not, a lot of the time what you're really trying to, where debates are won or lost are really the kind of end mileage, the extent to which claims are more or less proven. And I think there's a couple of things that you could consider to assess that. So the first thing I have is depth of reasoning. Now I've said assertions all the way down, and the reason why I said that is because at the end of the day, debating is not, like, the extent to which people prove things in debating is itself a little suspect. Now, that might seem crazy because I've spent like the last, 20 minutes saying all the various ways in which you can assess it. But at the end of the day, like, a lot of what we're saying are just statements, and those statements could potentially be true or not true. Now, that might be kind of disheartening to hear, but really, like, I think one way of getting around it is those statements could be broken down into littler statements. And the team that often provides more littler statements, like, oh, instead of just saying, well, this just definitely is good, the team that goes, well, this is good because of this other thing, which could be questionable, well, that is at least one extra layer of logic than provided than the other team, which I think is sufficient for it to be relatively more proven. The other thing that I think is kind of important to consider is the specificity of the reason to condition. So what I mean by this is often teams can just say a lot of reasons for things, and you want to ask yourself, well, how much of those reasons really pertain specifically to the conclusion they're trying to go for? That's quite important because, there are a lot of things debaters love saying, like short-term electoral incentives, like corruption, and they make all these claims, and you probably go like, well, I've heard that a million times. And yeah, maybe you've heard that a million times, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that claim is quite credible. In fact, it probably means the opposite. It probably means that claim isn't specific enough to be very good at proving the precise conclusion that the debate entails. The last thing that I think is important, and I think teams actually, adjudicators miss this, is that sometimes you can just claim an argument as being more proven than another by just pointing to the fact that it's been elaborated on, or maybe it hasn't been elaborated to you more, or you're just better able to conceptualize and imagine it because it's been illustrated well. It's been provided with examples that the average reasonable person would find persuasive. Now, I think maybe the reason why people tend to not go for that is because, you know, we're told, if you've ever done debating in high school, like examples are like the least important part of an argument. You gotta have reasons, which is true, I suspect. But, you know, in the world where the reasons fail you and you really are struggling to find other ways of differentiating two different arguments, ultimately at the end of the day, like an argument is better described, something that's better grounded, something that you can imagine versus an argument you can't quite conceptualize. The former argument is a better argument, and that's a completely valid way of assessing and making a judgment, so long as you justify it and show that the other options have been exhausted. Okay, where am I going? 7. All right, I've got a bit of time. All right, so the last thing I have is a kind of section on like advice when allocating speaks. Now, I've referred to it as a speaks trilemma. You know, when you think about it, the speaker's score system that we have is quite overloaded. Like, it's doing quite a lot of different things. The first thing it's doing is that it's sort of evaluating speeches on an absolute basis. So like, we have a speaker scale, and we have some idea as a circuit of what like a 78 is versus a 76, and you're assessing it on that basis. The next thing you're also doing is you're rewarding speakers within the debate based on their relative contribution to the debate. So maybe you thought the best speech in the debate was like second negative, therefore they should get the highest speaks in the debate. And lastly, when we sum up the speaks and do the difference, they need to reflect the margin of victory in the debate. So like, really close debates are 1-point margins, really blowout debates are like 5-point margins, things like that. Now, that's a lot of things that one number for each speaker sort of has to represent. And sometimes that gets quite difficult, and here are a few tips on how to adjudicate it. So, when it comes to kind of considering what the absolute merits of a performance are, what I've written there are just like phrases that are kind of prevalent in the speaker's score kind of rubric. So like gaps, inconsistencies in speech, lack of depth. I think maybe the best way to think about how to interpret those phrases is that those gaps and inconsistencies might point to what we would say in our system of proving an argument, problems in the initial construction of a speech. That's quite distinct from, say, a response or an argument that is quite strong but gets invalidated by a good response. I think a lot of speakers, or a lot of judges rather, would sometimes be hesitant to give very high speaks to an argument that has been rebutted. But I would say, don't be hesitant. Like, if it's like, you know, like the whole point of debating is that arguments can be rebutted. You can be a very good first affirmative speech, but it gets rebutted by a very, very good third negative speech. The third negative speech doesn't make the first affirmative speech look bad. It was just good on its own terms. So I think whether arguments have been responded to or not is not a very as effective proxy of how good the argument, how well scoring the speech is, as opposed to just considering whether the speech on its own terms, in terms of its own construction, was in fact well constructed. I think when it comes to adjudicating relative contributions to debate, I have a couple more thoughts on this. I think the first big one is that you want to, as a first port of call, figure out what each speaker's marginal or unique contribution to debate actually is. So the reason why I say that is because, you know, the chronology, the inherent chronology of a debate inherently means that, like, when you're saying something at, let's say, third affirmative, you're not saying those things in a vacuum. You're likely building off arguments that your first and second affirmative speaker have worked very hard to build for you, which means at the end of the day, you shouldn't be credited for like the whole shebang. You really should be credited for the 1 or 2 important key responses that you add to that debate. The other thing that I think is kind of important to consider is what the opportunity cost of what a speaker didn't say their speaking time is. And I think that's actually quite a handy test. So for example, like, sometimes it's like, you might hear, like, I've heard sometimes like judges go like, well, you know, like, you're the third negative speech. Third speakers typically do a lot of weighing, but you didn't really do a lot of weighing, so that wasn't great. And look, maybe that is like generally fair as a rule of thumb, but you have to ask yourself, like, well, maybe the third negative didn't do weighing because the second negative did the weighing. And therefore, by just repeating the weighing, it wouldn't have really been very useful kind of marginal contribution to debate. And instead, the opportunity cost of that would be like, instead of weighing, they could have actually just like taken out a few additional claims from the affirmative team and really make sure that the margin of the debate and the victory towards the negative was quite clear. That's a really useful contribution. Even if it's not a contribution that you would say is typically expected, it's still a valuable and value-adding contribution to debate. The third tip I have is that you want to reward actions that aren't just about winning the debate that happen, but also making the debate much, much better. So I think the classic example of this is like preemption. Like if you think about it, being a very preemptive, let's say, first speaker, inherently means that the debate doesn't, like, it inherently isn't useful to the debate that happened. Because if the preemption was good, it probably just scared the team from making the argument that they probably would have run if not for the preemption. And the problem often is just that the adjudicator goes, well, this preemption was there, but like the negative team never said it. Never said the argument was meant to be preempted. So like, I don't know how valuable it was to the debate. But no, like that's why it's valuable. Like it scared the other team from making that claim. So often, rewarding actions that just made the overall debate better is quite useful, even if it wasn't necessarily necessary to winning the debate that actually happened. Another good example of this is like setup, like being very clear in characterization, establishing what the parameters of the debate is. Like maybe that wasn't useful to the debate because the clash became, about something else, deeper in the causal chain. But it's still like important to say. And if you didn't say it, well, it probably would have made the debate a lot worse. So you should credit the speaker for that. The last thing I have is that ceilings need foundations. So I think, there is, I guess, an understandable kind of willingness to credit responses that are made at the absolute end. And I think that makes sense, right? Because debates reach a point of complexity. There needs to be a resolution, and the resolution is impactful to the outcome of the debate. But, there were speeches that got you there, and I think those speeches should be kind of worth contributing and rewarding too. It's the same way that, for example, I guess in sports like football and soccer, you get a lot of praise for being the last person to kick the ball in the net, but someone also passed that ball to you. Someone, made the tackle to get that ball towards you. And without those actions, that wouldn't have happened. And both of the things are equally important. Okay, I think, that's pretty much it. Cool. If you have any questions, you can either hold them out now or I'm on Facebook, so if you ever want to need any help with stuff, be happy to help out.
Guys, just like three really quick things if you're in the Melbourne contingent. Tom is not here unfortunately, so